Okay, welcome back to the other design issue we're going to be talking about for Unit 8, and that is focus on focus. So what this really is a chance for us to return to the talk about emphasis and hierarchy, also bring in some discussion about dominance and how dominance is different from emphasis and focus. And to a degree, I want you to think about how all these words are similar in meaning, but they have slight differences, and those slight differences can be pretty important when we think about the subtle differences about how a work of art works. But let's first just kind of begin with why we're talking about focus. We're talking about focus because we just finished a unit on photography. And like I discussed, in photography, control of focus is one of the primary ways that an artist, a photographer, can control our attention and so that's one of the reasons why we learned about depth of field. It seems when you first learn about depth of field, it seems like a very kind of inside baseball sort of issue, something that only a photographer would really ever be concerned with. But when it comes to thinking about how this photograph works, how it directs our attention to one subject and some parts of that one subject in a very specific way, but then other places are very low attention, right? Why are they low attention? What is the image doing to convince us it's an area of low attention? And that has everything to do with how she's controlling focus, Diane Arbus in this case. So, plus it's a fun image to look at. It always makes me happy. So we can see that in other photographers' work, although like this is a much deeper depth of field, right? So, and he's as much directing our attention through compositional decisions as he is through the technical use of the camera. And here's an interesting one where it appears when you first look at it like it's a very, you know, very dramatic use of depth of field as a way of directing our attention. But if you actually really look at how much focus there is on these buildings that are, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of feet away, but how much focus there is on those buildings, you realize that this is actually a very deep depth of field. What's actually creating this sense of attention and focus on these figures is really the change in value. It's the fact that the atmosphere is making all of these values, that value range, very, very narrow, whereas this value range is a much wider range. And those are therefore more high contrast images. And that's the thing that creates this dramatic bringing of our attention to these figures. So here are some other examples in photography of most of these are actually controlling actual focus, although Sugimoto is also using some effects. And actually Cindy Sherman's not really controlling focus because she's using a projection. Of course, the projection behind her as a model is in of itself less in focus than she is. But Sally Mann is definitely using depth of field and control of focus to be a way of controlling attention as to what we see first, what we see as a primary, what we keep returning to. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between focus and emphasis versus dominance. I guess the first thing I want to say is that emphasis is slightly different from focus, right? Like generally in terms of focus, even when we're talking about artworks that are not photography, we're generally talking about attention on a specific thing, right? And we're talking about issues of sharpness of edge and detail and contrast are the primary things that really kind of clue us into kind of focus. But emphasis can be made in other ways, such as just through scale, and through directing lines, pointing, like implied lines, pointing things, or even through color choice are other ways of creating emphasis. So focus and emphasis are slightly different, but they tend to work hand in hand. But how is focus and emphasis different from dominance? Right? Because oftentimes when artists are talking about a work of art, they might talk about dominance and they might talk about hierarchy in terms of like some areas, some shapes being dominant versus some shapes being subordinate. And I think the best way to understand the differences between these things is to see it in action. So here are two paintings where we can clearly see the difference between emphasis, right? and then to a degree focus versus dominance, right? Very often I tell students that dominance is generally an issue about shape to shape interaction, whereas emphasis is a lot more about moments and areas. So in this painting here, right, if we're thinking about it in terms of dominance, we think, ooh, this big red square is the dominant moment in the painting. It dominates, everything else dominates. The blue dominates the yellow. But when I think about what is the moment that has the most emphasis and definitely the most focus, I think of it as this moment right here, the moment of intersection between the blue and the red and the whites and the black, all of them coming together. That is like that core moment of the piece. And so for me, that's kind of fundamentally the difference between emphasis and focus versus dominance. Dominance is about shapes. Emphasis and focus is about what moment is our eye being drawn to. Um, so you can then start to see how, sure, okay, the relationship between the black and the red square is a relationship between dominance and subordinates. But what's the most interesting moment in this piece is this moment, the moment between the two, right? The it's corner to corner and the space in between. That's the thing that really kind of draws our attention, draws, and that is the thing that has the most sense of emphasis and focus. Now think about that. Like it's easy to see those kind of issues in terms of like a non-objective or abstract work like a Mondrian. It's a lot harder to see it in a painting like this. But think about this. We don't even notice this shape, this big sort of dominant shape. There's kind of big dominant dark shape that's made up of the ceiling and also some of these tapestries and these paintings hanging on this back wall. But there's this big kind of shape of darkness that's hanging down, hanging above everything in this painting. That's a very dominant shape, but it really has no emphasis on it and no focus on it, right? Everything that the artist is doing is telling us that this is not an area that we should be paying much attention to. So it's dominant in a certain way because it sets the mood and because it hangs over this scene. But really the attention, right, is in here. The emphasis and the focus is in here. So you can kind of see how the relationship between dominance and focus and emphasis can play out. And I want to make a contrast between these two. How many more do I have on this? Oh, I do have quite a few. Um, the main contrast I want to make here has to do with the issue of focus, right? That focus itself, and it is not just a painterly issue, right? There are lots of ways that this painting is creating emphasis, right? Drawing our attention to there is through value contrast, it's through directing lines, all the eyes looking towards us, all these different things are going on that are bringing our attention, right? And in this painting, all of our attention is being brought to this moment. But there's one moment in this painting that is really bringing our attention almost entirely through this idea of focus, right? This elbow right there is kind of a secondary focus, right? You may say that it's less of an important focus than even his head or these people's heads, right? But the more I look at this painting, the more I can hardly see anything other than that elbow because of how beautiful it is painted. But it's the attention to it and the sense of it being super in focus, super there, right? That makes it a really important part of this painting. Everything else about the painting, like this big arc, is all leading us to here. All right, that is my 1 minute mark. So I'm going to end there, and then we'll do part 2 in just a second.